The air is heavy, not merely with smoke or the fumes of promethium that seep endlessly from the manufactorums, but with something older, more suffocating, an invisible weight that presses against the bones of every soul who still breathes within the hive. It is the silence between screams, the slow collapse of order, the bitter realization that the walls which once promised safety are now little more than tombstones stacked to the sky. This is not a story of heroes nor of victories sung in triumph. It is a chronicle of rot and despair, of a hive city in its death throes, folding in on itself like a carcass left too long in the dark. And in the end, the question that lingers is not whether salvation will come, but how long the flesh will resist the inevitable teeth of madness. If you are drawn to stories where steel and spirit clash against inevitability, if you want to walk the broken streets of the Imperium's forgotten underbellies, then remain here. Share this with those who crave the taste of ashes in their mouths, and join us, subscribe to this archive of shadows, so that the tales of what is lost are not lost forever. Every echo deserves a witness. Every fall demands remembrance. Now, before we descend fully, let us trace the shape of this city's ruin. Not in facts alone, but in fragments of memory and prayer. In whispers passed through bloodied lips, in the soft sound of boots on cracked ferrocrete, 10 movements, 10 descents into the same abyss, each one unveiling another layer of suffocation until the core of madness is exposed like a heart beating, too long after the body has died. The hive was never silent. Even in its dying days, when the machines faltered and the manufactorums no longer thundered with the rhythm of endless labor, there was always a murmur beneath the surface, a rasping breath that came from a million lungs struggling in unison. The air itself seemed to groan with the weight of smoke, promethium fumes, and the restless heat of overcrowded bodies pressed too tightly together. In the upper spires, filters strained and failed, their cogitators sparking as they labored beyond their years. In the depths of the hab stacks, the air had long since turned into something less than breathable, a black dust that clung to tongues, scoured throats, and filled every cough with the taste of rust and sorrow. It was not merely the body that choked. The soul too bent beneath the press of unclean air. Children learned to cough before they learned to walk, and the old learned to fear sleep because each night could be the last one their lungs endured. Ash became a companion, always present, drifting in the light like the silent remnants of something burning that no one had ever seen extinguished. Men carried it in their hair. Women brushed it from the faces of infants, and still it returned, as though the hive itself shed its skin one layer at a time, dusting its people in its slow suicide. Yet still they endured. Endurance was not a choice. It was the creed pressed into them since birth. The Imperium did not ask its people to live well, only to live long enough to serve. So they queued for hours, winding through corridors lit by failing lumen strips, waiting for ration slabs that tasted of nothing but kept bones upright. They shuffled past the murals of the Emperor painted on cracked ferrocrete, their eyes lingering long enough to whisper a prayer, but not long enough to be accused of idleness by the patrolling enforcers. The lines bent and twisted like serpents in the dust, and every whisper was a secret carried only inches before the ash swallowed it whole. Violence was not new in the hive, but something in the air had sharpened it, had given it a bitterness that bled into every glance. A spilled ration slab could spark fists. A broken filter mask could spill blood. It was as though the ash itself taught cruelty, whispering into ears when voices were weakest. The arbitrators knew it, their black carapace armor moving through the lines with the weight of inevitability, shock mauls ready, bolt pistols heavy at their hips. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their presence was sermon enough, but even they were fewer now, stretched thin, their visors reflecting only fear where once there had been obedience. And through all of it, the city seemed to groan. Pipes rattled without reason. Vox grills sputtered static prayers and half-finished canticles, repeating verses until they warped into droning madness. Hab lifts hung silent between levels, suspended like corpses on invisible hooks. Rumors spread of whole sectors sealed without warning. Doors welded shut from the outside. Some said it was plague, others sabotage. Still others whispered of something deeper, a corruption that did not need names to terrify. But no matter the rumor, ash found its way through every crack. For those who lived in the lower levels, the ash was not just nuisance but sustenance. Filters were stripped from broken rebreathers and burned, inhaled as if they contained something more than dust. Cracked pipes leaking chemical warmth were fought over like treasures. Children with hollow bellies and eyes too large for their faces darted through shadows, their coughs echoing like tiny alarms in the endless dark. And above it all, the hum of industry grew quieter, leaving space for those coughs to sound louder, sharper, like nails driven into a coffin that had not yet closed. There was still faith, though faith too was laced with ash. The ecclesiarchy priests stood on rusted platforms, their robes gray with soot no matter how often they tried to cleanse them. They spoke of endurance, of loyalty, of the emperor's gaze watching even here in the lowest of places. Their voices cracked from the same poison air, their coughs hidden behind desperate chants, and still the crowds came. Not because they believed fully, but because belief was one of the last things they could hold without being torn from their hands. Yet even the sermons had grown restless, filled with sharper warnings and harder words. When the ash itself could choke the voice of the priest, what hope was left for the laity? Every night the same image played out. Families huddled in their hab cells, lumen globes flickering, filters droning weakly, coughing until their lungs grew raw. Somewhere distant, alarms wailed like wounded beasts unanswered. Somewhere else, gunfire rattled through corridors sharp and brief, and always the ash came drifting in through cracks, through vents, through gaps in the ferrocrete, settling like judgment on those who still dreamed of escape. But there was no escape. There never was. The Hive was a world within a world, sealed by design, its people kept in place like bones in a sarcophagus. On the streets, the statues of long-dead governors stood draped in soot, their faces obscured, their aquillas half swallowed by grime. To some, they were symbols of endurance, the silent reminder that men had stood before and would stand again. To others, they were empty shells, monuments to a rule that no longer remembered its own name. At night, those statues became gathering places for shadows, for the desperate and the lost, for gangs who whispered of rebellion in the same breath as they whispered of starvation. The arbitrators could disperse them, but they always returned, like the ash itself. The Hive was breathing slower now, each cough a warning, each plume of smoke a sigh. To those who had lived their entire lives in its bowels, the difference was subtle but undeniable. It was as though the city itself had grown weary of supporting them, weary of feeding them, weary of the endless burden of human desperation. And in that weariness, cracks widened not just in ferrocrete walls, but in the fragile fabric that kept men from becoming beasts. The ash did not kill quickly. It simply lingered day after day until it felt less like an intruder and more like a herald. For ash is what remains when fire has already had its way. And though no one dared say it aloud, all who coughed through the night wondered the same silent thing. If this was only the beginning, then what fire had burned so hot that its shadow could choke them all? Hunger was older than the Hive, older than ferrocrete and steel. It was the first sermon the city had ever preached, and it had never lost its voice. At first it was subtle, a gnawing beneath the ribs that could be ignored with ration slabs and thin broth with recycled protein that tasted of oil and salt. But hunger is patient, and in the Hive it had endless congregations. It whispered first in the bellies of children, who cried louder than the sermon of any priest, and then it spread through their parents, through workers who bent their backs in manufactorums and found nothing to fill them afterward. Eventually, it was everywhere, as much a part of the air as ash. The lines for food grew longer. At first, they coiled neatly, kept in place by the sharp eyes of arbitrators and the swinging shock mauls they carried. But the further down one went, the more those lines bent into chaos. In the underhive, where the dust never cleared and the lumen strips died one after another, there was no order. People pressed together like animals, clawing, pushing, screaming for the promise of a meal that might never come. There was blood in those lines, spilled quietly at first, then openly, as knives and broken pipes became tools of hunger as much as weapons of war. And the queues did not shorten. No matter how many died, they always stretched further. The ecclesiarchy knew this, of course. Their pulpits shook with the force of their sermons. Priests cried out that hunger was a trial sent by the God Emperor, a fire through which loyalty must be proven. Obedience fills the soul, they rasped through vox grills clogged with dust, and only the obedient shall be sustained. But the words did not feed the body, and fewer bowed their heads as the days crawled on. People still came because where else was there to go? But their prayers were muttered, their eyes restless, their lips pale and cracked. The statues of saints were draped with offerings of crumbs, bones, anything left over from a meal. Some swore the statues wept when the scraps were taken back again. too precious to leave behind. When hunger turns sermons hollow, new preachers rise. They were not priests, not even men of learning, but they carried a voice sharper than doctrine. In alleys and forgotten chapels, they whispered that bread was worth more than faith, that the emperor had abandoned them, that no god would let his children choke and starve beneath the weight of a dying hive. They did not wear robes, but their gaunt faces and blazing eyes became vestments of their own. People listened, not because they believed fully, but because hunger left them too weak to doubt. In the silence between a child's sobs, a false word could sound holy. The arbitrators tried to silence them, dragging these street preachers into cells and leaving them to rot. But for everyone taken, two more voices rose. They did not shout. They did not need to. Hunger carried their words into every ear. It gave sermons sharper teeth than the ecclesiarchy had ever wielded. Why pray for sustenance, they asked, when you can take it with your own hands? And hands began to close around what was once shared. Families who once pooled their rations turned against one another. Neighbors who once carried water together locked their doors. The hive grew quieter, but only because the growl of hunger had taken the place of speech. Industry did not help. As manufacturums slowed, so too did the flow of ration slabs. Entire sectors reported shortages. Trucks that once rumbled through tunnels arrived empty or not at all. Rumors whispered that tithe ships bound for Terra had been filled with food, while the people here were left to rot. Others claimed the administratum had miscounted again, reducing their allotment to dust. It mattered little which rumor was true. All that mattered was that bellies stayed empty, and empty bellies do not wait politely. There were riots, small at first, then louder. A shipment of grox meat, rare beyond belief, was overturned in Sector 19B, the slabs torn apart in seconds by dozens of hands. The arbitrators fired into the crowd, bolt rounds cracking skulls. But hunger does not fear death when it is already eating you from within. The priests who came after tried to sanctify the blood spilled, to call it a sacrifice to the emperor, but their words fell like stones into the silence of the starving. Still, the sermons continued. In cracked chapels, candles burned low and thin, their wax mixed with grease to keep them alive. Priests bellowed that hunger was a weapon wielded against them by xenos or heretics, that the emperor demanded endurance. Their eyes wept from the smoke. Their voices rasped with each word, but they spoke until they collapsed, coughing blood into their robes. It was not faith that kept them upright. It was desperation, the same desperation that drove the people to listen. And through it all, hunger became ritual. People counted their ribs in the morning like beads on a rosary. Children dreamed of food they had never tasted, describing fruits and meats as if they were saints. Bones cracked under skin stretched too thin. And still the priests spoke. Still the crowds gathered. Still the hive sank deeper into silence. At night, when the ash settled thickest and even the lumen strips seemed too weak to glow, the hive spoke with the only voice it had left. Not machines, not sermons, not the rattling hymn of manufacturums, just the sound of 1,000 empty bellies growling in the dark, harmonizing in a choir more haunting than any prayer. Hunger had become its own sermon. And all who listened knew it would not end with words. The hive was built on rhythm. Not the rhythm of hearts or footsteps, but the pounding of machines that never rested, the clatter of assembly lines, the endless roar of manufacturums producing bolts, laser guns, shells, and armor plates for wars that raged light years away. That rhythm was the hive's heartbeat. It was what gave meaning to its people. For though they lived short lives in squalor, their work kept the Imperium alive. But when that heartbeat faltered, the hive itself began to die. It started small, as all disasters do. A single line of servitors locked in place, their augmetic limbs twitching uselessly while sparks showered the floor. At first, the overseers beat them back into motion, screaming binaric prayers into vox grills that had long ceased to carry the voice of the Omnissiah. The line shuddered, lurched forward, and carried on. But as days stretched, the malfunctions spread. Cogitators spat out nonsense instead of commands. Their screens filled with fragments of code like the rantings of a madman. Conveyor belts froze mid-motion, half-assembled lasrifles lying forgotten while workers clawed at jammed gears with bleeding fingers. The magos who governed the manufacturums claimed control was not lost. They spoke of temporary disruptions, of sacred maintenance rituals delayed, of patience demanded by the machine god. They droned their reassurances from the safety of their towers, their voices echoing cold and metallic. But the workers knew the truth. The rhythm was gone. Each day fewer machines sang their iron hymns, and in the silence that grew between them, the hive seemed to shiver. Without machines, time itself twisted. For centuries, the people had measured their lives not in days but in shifts. The bell of the manufactorum told them when to wake, when to labor, when to eat, when to collapse into their hab cells. Now, without its thunder, they drifted. Shifts stretched or collapsed with no warning. Some still came to work, standing before silent machines as if their presence alone might coax them back into motion. Others vanished into the hive, searching for food, for air, for anything that made sense. The absence of the machine's voice left them hollow, unmoored, as though they had been torn loose from the Emperor's plan. The Skitarii patrolled more frequently, their augmetic eyes glowing in the darkened corridors, their rifles leveled at anyone who lingered too long near the silent lines. At first, they had guarded the machines from theft or sabotage, but as the malfunctions spread, their patrols turned inward. Workers were herded into pens, their numbers counted, their movements tracked. Rumors whispered that the Magos feared rebellion more than machine failure, that the Adeptus Mechanicus knew the hive could not survive without production, and were prepared to cull the excess mouths if order wavered. None spoke those words aloud, for fear of augmetic ears listening, but all thought them in silence. Servitors, once tireless, now twitched like broken marionettes. Their flesh sagged where augmetics had torn loose, their eyes flickering with static. Some wandered aimlessly, repeating fragments of binaric hymns, their voices glitching into screams. Others simply froze, locked in positions of labor they would never finish. Their mechanical arms extended toward conveyor belts that no longer moved. To see a servitor fail was to glimpse the hive's true fragility. For centuries, the people had believed these half-men, half-machines were eternal, but even they could die, and when they did, the silence that followed was louder than any explosion. The people grew restless. Hunger gnawed at them, ash choked them, and now the machines abandoned them. Without the manufactorums, there would be no rations, no pay, no meaning to their labor. The ecclesiarchy preached endurance, but fewer listened now. What good was obedience when the emperor's work no longer needed doing? A man without labor was a man without place, and in the hive, a man without place was already halfway dead. The riots began in Sector 22F, where an entire manufactorum floor had lain silent for 3 days. The workers demanded answers, pounding on sealed doors, their voices echoing through empty chambers. When no one answered, they broke inside, dragging overseers from their offices. Their fury was blind, born not of hatred but of fear. They needed the rhythm back, needed the machines to sing, and when they could not, they tore apart those who had promised they would. The Arbites responded swiftly, their boots echoing on metal stairwells, their bolters cutting men down in orderly volleys. The screams filled the silence where machines had once been, and for a moment, the hive's rhythm was replaced by death. But killing the desperate did not restart the lines. The manufactorums remained silent. Entire floors were abandoned, their machines gathering dust, their cogitators frozen in endless loops of corrupted code. The Skitarii guarded them still, their rifles gleaming. But what they guarded was no longer industry. It was a tomb, a shrine to a machine spirit that had turned its face away. And in the stillness, rumors began. Some whispered that the Omnissiah had abandoned them for failures in ritual. Others claimed darker forces at work, that xenos had infiltrated the hive's depths, whispering their poison into machine code, corrupting it from below. A few, pale-eyed and shaking, swore that they had heard voices when they stood near the silent lines, whispers rising from the cogitators in a language they could not understand. The priest called it heresy. The Magos dismissed it as madness, but the whispers grew louder in the telling, and hunger made men ready to believe anything. The hive no longer sang. Its heartbeat had faltered, its breath choked with ash, its stomach hollow with hunger, and in that silence something else seemed to stir, watching with patient eyes as men searched for meaning where there was none. The rhythm of machines was gone, and what replaced it was far older, far darker, and waiting to claim the hive one breath at a time. The hive had always feared its own depths. Even in its prime, when manufactorums roared and the upper spires gleamed beneath the Emperor's light, the underhive was a place of exile and shadows. It was said that the hive was built not upon stone but upon itself, Layer upon layer, centuries of rubble and ruin crushed beneath newer towers. Down there, the walls sweated rust. The air stank of oil and rot, and the only light came from the phosphorescence of fungus that clung to dripping pipes. The depths were where the forgotten went to vanish. Now, with the machines faltering and hunger hollowing the city, more eyes turned downward. Rumors carried on whispers, crawling up through levels like smoke. They spoke of shapes moving where no lumen burned, of entire work crews vanishing in silence, of footsteps echoing behind scavengers who swore they were alone. Some told of flickering lights in collapsed corridors, too steady to be fire and too restless to be machines. Others said they had seen faces in the dark, pale and inhuman, watching from cracks in the ferrocrete. At first, the people laughed. The depths had always birthed stories, mutants, heretics, forbidden cults. Fear was the native tongue of the Underhive, but laughter faded quickly when the stories did not stop. A miner emerged from the lower shafts with his eyes wide and empty, his voice reduced to broken whispers. He spoke of a sound like chanting, though no words could be remembered. He said the walls themselves moved as though they breathed, and when he tried to pray, something laughed in the darkness. He died within hours, his lips cracked and bleeding, his hands clawed to the bone from scratching at his own ears. Others followed. Scavengers returned pale, their clothes soaked with water that smelled of metal and decay. They claimed they had heard children crying in the dark, voices begging for help that led them deeper until the sound turned into something else, something that spoke their names, something that told them to keep walking. They turned back, but not all of them did. The ones who did return swore their shadows moved wrong in the lumen glow, stretching too long or bending when they should not. The Arbites sealed sectors, declaring them unsafe, ordering walls welded shut. They spoke of instability, of collapsed supports, of air that could not be breathed. But whispers carried faster than orders. People knew better. They knew the Arbites sealed the doors not to protect, but to contain, to keep something inside. In the Habstacks, mothers hushed their children with warnings not to wander too far, not to follow strange sounds, not to look too long into the dark. Fathers sharpened blades that had never been needed before, and still the depths called. Hunger drove men downward in search of forgotten storerooms, abandoned lines, anything that might sustain them. Entire groups vanished that way. Their names lingered on the lips of their neighbors for a while, then faded, swallowed like everything else. And those who survived the journeys returned changed. Their eyes darted too quickly. Their voices stammered with words they could not shape. Some carried objects, old data slates etched with sigils no one could read, chunks of stone carved with patterns that seemed to shift when looked at too long. The priests declared them cursed. The magos burned them with sacred oils, and yet fragments always remained. They were traded in shadows, passed hand to hand like relics of a faith no one admitted to worship. The ecclesiarchy thundered from its pulpits, declaring the whispers heresy, the depths a place of corruption where only the faithless dared tread. But even their sermons trembled. Everyone knew that priests too had vanished below, chasing their flocks, seeking to cleanse with fire what could not be burned. None had returned, and in their absence new sermons rose, softer and more dangerous. Voices whispered that the Emperor's silence was not absence but warning, that he had abandoned the Hive because something else had claimed it. On the Vox, static bled into strange rhythms. Cogitators flickered with images not keyed by any operator, shadows etched against the screens. Some claimed to see faces in the patterns, mouths moving in silent prayer. The Adeptus Mechanicus swore it was nothing more than feedback from failing systems. But those who had heard the depths knew better. Machines, they whispered, carried voices just as men did, and the machines were listening to something below. Every night the Hive grew quieter. The machines stalled, the ration lines thinned, the Arbites sealed more corridors, and in that silence the rumors grew into something heavier, sharper. It was not just stories now. It was belief. People prayed not only to the Emperor, but to whatever else might hear them in the dark. They prayed for mercy, for food, for air, for release from the ash that filled their lungs, and some, when their prayers were not answered, swore they heard laughter instead. The depths of the Hive were endless. They had always been endless, but now they were awake, and whatever stirred below had already begun to climb. At first it was only whispers. Old men muttering in the glow of failing lumen strips, women clutching their children tighter in the dark. They said the dead were speaking, that voices long gone echoed through the Hive's endless corridors. Most dismissed it, delirium born of hunger or the madness that came from breathing too much rust dust and ash. But then the voices grew clearer. Names were called aloud in the night. Voices of fathers, mothers, lovers long buried. The tones were perfect, undeniable, as though the air itself remembered them. Some who heard ran toward the sound, weeping, begging. Others sealed their ears with rags, afraid to know what awaited. Few returned, and those who did came back changed. Eyes hollow, mouths trembling with hymns no one had ever heard before. The first preacher emerged from the waste chutes of Sector 19, a gaunt figure, hair matted with grease, robes stitched from torn ration sacks. He claimed he had walked in the dark for 7 days without hunger, sustained by voices that filled his mind with warmth. He called it the chorus below. He said it was mercy that the hive had not been abandoned but chosen. His sermons drew the desperate, the broken, the hungry, and when he sang the strange notes that filled his lungs, others joined until the corridors themselves seemed to hum. Then came more. Not just one preacher, but dozens. Some were known as scavengers, others as missing workers thought dead. All returned with the same words, that the depths had spoken, that they had seen light where no lumen shone, that they had been touched by something vast. Their sermons spread like fungus, blooming in forgotten corners, filling abandoned manufactorums with gathering crowds. The ecclesiarchy denounced them as heretics. The Arbites broke assemblies, scattering crowds with shock mauls and fire. But the preachers did not resist. They smiled as bones cracked under batons, they sang as they burned, and those who watched could not help but wonder, why did the flames burn so slowly? Why did their screams sound less like pain and more like hymns? More disturbing still were the signs that followed them. Corpses that should have rotted remained fresh for weeks, lips moving faintly as though caught in prayer. Machine spirits faltered in their presence, Auspex readings warping, Vox units bleeding static that sometimes formed words. One Arbit officer swore he had seen his dead captain standing among the crowd, lips moving in unison with the heretics. When he fired, the body fell, empty and silent, but the hymn carried on. In habstacks, children woke at night singing songs they could not have learned. Mothers wept as their infants whispered in voices far too deep, speaking in tongues older than the hive itself. Men who had never spoken a word of faith began carving symbols into their skin, circles and spirals that seemed to move when one looked too long. When asked why, they only smiled and said, "Because the dead told me to." The preachers did not stay in one place. They wandered the hive, moving upward from the depths, their flocks growing behind them like rivers swelling with rain. They left no food, no coin, no hope of survival. Only their words, their hymns, their endless promise. The hive is chosen. The dead have risen. The chorus below will guide us. The Arbits tried to silence them. Raids grew bloodier, punishments harsher, but every execution birthed 2 more preachers, each carrying the same message. And slowly, people stopped resisting. It was not courage but fatigue. The hive was dying and the emperor was silent. Perhaps, they thought, it was not heresy but hope that came from the dark. The Adeptus Mechanicus grew uneasy. Servitors malfunctioned in entire sectors, their Vox systems hijacked by strange cadences. Cogitators displayed streams of text in languages no tech priest could identify. Some claimed to hear singing from the machines themselves, as though the dead had colonized the very circuits. Amagos attempted to purge one such corruption with fire and steel. Hours later, his body was found inside a data shrine, his flesh peeled into thin sheets and draped like parchment across the consoles. His blood had dried into perfect circles that hummed when touched, and still, the sermons spread. Some claimed they heard them even when alone, echoes that came not from mouths but from their own thoughts. The dead did not need pulpits anymore. They had found other ways to speak. By the time the ecclesiarchy announced a crusade of cleansing fire, it was already too late. The dead were everywhere, in the machines, in the walls, in the voices of the living. The hive had become a cathedral of whispers. Its prayers were no longer for salvation but for surrender. And in the silence after every sermon, one truth remained. The dead were not warning them. The dead were waiting. It began with hunger, as all things in the hive begin. At first, the sermons promised only words, but words alone cannot still the gnawing of empty bellies. The preachers began to offer more. They called it the Feast of Ash. It was not food, not in the way the hive had once known, but the starving did not care. Bowls of pale dust, collected from burnt refuse and the bones of the forgotten, were passed down the line like holy sacrament. Those who swallowed it swore they felt warmth fill their veins, a strange fullness rising in their hollow stomachs. None could explain how such filth could nourish, yet those who ate survived. Days stretched into weeks, their bodies somehow enduring while others wasted away. The Arbits tried to break these gatherings, smashing bowls, scattering ash into the drains. But the faithful knelt and scooped it up with bare hands, licking the grime from their palms with tears of gratitude. Soon the ash was not enough. The preachers spoke of a deeper communion. They led their followers into dark manufactorums, where furnaces still burned with guttering promethium flames. There the ash was mixed with oil, with grease, with things taken from the machines themselves. Some whispered it was mixed with blood, though none dared say whose. They drank it in silence, and when they rose, their eyes shone with a fever that even hunger could not explain. Those who partook grew strange. Their voices deepened, carrying resonance that made lumen strips flicker. Their shadows stretched unnaturally long, writhing across the walls as though alive. And when they spoke, others listened, not because of faith or loyalty, but because something within their words compelled obedience. Witnesses described one such gathering in Habstack 41. Hundreds sat in silence, bowls cradled in trembling hands. A preacher raised a chalice of blackened ash, intoning words in a language no one recognized. As the crowd drank, the walls seemed to tremble, pipes groaning as if the hive itself drank alongside them. When it was done, they began to sing, not with voices but with the vibration of their very bones, a hum that rattled the teeth of those who heard it. The ecclesiarchy screamed blasphemy. Fire was brought against the faithful, yet when flamer units entered one of the ash halls, their weapons sputtered and died, flames collapsing into oily smoke. The soldiers panicked, choking, while the faithful rose calmly and spread the ash across their faces like war paint. Those who escaped swore they saw the dead themselves among the congregation, sitting side by side with the living, mouths moving in perfect unison. And then came the first miracle, or the first curse. A child, frail and starving, collapsed during the feast. His heart stopped, his skin gray. The crowd began to wail until a preacher leaned over and pressed his lips to the child's. Ash flowed like breath from one mouth to another. The boy gasped, coughed, and opened his eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. He rose without trembling, without weakness, and sang with a voice deeper than his years should allow. The crowd fell silent, then erupted in praise. The story spread. Now every gathering prayed for their dead to rise again, and sometimes they did. Corpses shuddered, dust spilling from their lips, rising to stand among the living. They did not weep or smile. They only sang. Yet none dared turn them away. For what parent in a hive so broken would refuse their child return to them even if the eyes were not quite right? The hive began to change. Ash became currency, traded more dearly than food or water. The manufactorums once used for smelting iron or producing arms were repurposed as great ash kilns, where followers labored to grind, burn, and prepare the sacred dust. Some swore that whole bodies were fed into the flames, criminals, heretics, perhaps even volunteers eager to give themselves to the feast. But those who asked too many questions were never seen again. Soon, the rituals left the manufactorums and spilled into the streets. Great feasts were held in collapsed courtyards where ash was flung into the air until the skies turned gray. Children laughed through coughing fits, mouths wide as they tried to catch flakes on their tongues. The faithful smeared it on their walls, their doors, their very skin. In time, the hive itself looked coated in pale dust, as though the city were preparing its own burial. Not everyone accepted it. Some clung to the emperor, whispering prayers into cracked aquillas, begging for the light of Terra. Others hid from the feasts, refusing to eat, refusing to bow. But hunger is patient and hunger is cruel. In the end, most broke. Those who did not, well, the faithful made certain their ash was not wasted. There was one last thing, whispered only in fear. Those who partook too deeply sometimes changed. Their bodies swelled with strange growths, their veins blackened, their mouths split wider than they should. Yet they did not die. They only sang louder. And the hive sang with them, pipes humming, walls trembling, as if the city itself was joining in the feast. It was not food. It was not drink. It was communion. And the hive was no longer starving. But deep below, in the places where the ash was thickest, something else stirred. Something vast. Something waiting. The hive had always been alive in a sense, its endless machines pumping, its furnaces burning, its billions of voices a chorus of ceaseless labor. But now it breathed in ways it never had before. The walls themselves began to pulse, faint but steady, as if something beneath the ferrocrete skin had learned the rhythm of a heart. Those who had drunk the ash first noticed it. They pressed their hands against cold metal bulkheads and swore they could feel warmth, a thrum that answered their own blood. Pipes began to sweat. At first it looked like condensation, droplets of rusty water forming along the steel veins that crisscrossed the hive. But the liquid thickened, turned darker, until it resembled blood. It clung to the walls, dripping in slow rivulets that pooled along the floors, and the faithful knelt to collect it. They called it the lifeblood of the hive, the second gift after the ash. They anointed themselves with it, drank it, smeared it over their eyes until their vision swam. Those who partook claimed they could see further, hear whispers that guided them through the darkness. The Arbites declared it contagion. They sent in purging squads with flamers, sealing entire sectors as infection zones, but fire did not halt it. Burned walls blistered, and from the blackened stone new veins grew, winding upward like roots seeking light. Even sealed hablocks began to breathe. The city had decided what it would become, and no decree could halt its transformation. Rumors spread faster than truth. Some said the blood carried visions. Drink deep enough and you would see the hive from above, stretching not as metal and stone but as a living body. Sprawling limbs, a heart beating in the depths, lungs that wheezed with promethium smoke. Others whispered that the blood was not new, that the hive had always hidden veins beneath its skin, and only now had the faithful awakened them. But what frightened most was not the blood. It was the sound. At night, when the sermons fell silent and the ash feasts were done, a low hum rose from the floors. It was steady, like the droning of an organ, yet it carried a note of grief that wormed its way into the mind. Children wept without knowing why. Men woke from dreams with their teeth rattling, blood in their ears. Some said the hive was trying to speak. Others said it was mourning. But all agreed. The city itself was no longer silent. The Mechanicus grew frantic. Tech priests dissected pipes, carved open walls, desperate to prove it was only rust, only fungus, only the illusions of hysteria. What they found defied their catechisms. The veins bled when cut, clotting sluggishly. The walls grew warm when pried open, beating faintly beneath their mechadendrites. Some who stared too long at the exposed tissue swore it stared back, patterns of veins forming eyes that blinked before dissolving back into flesh. A few tech priests vanished entirely, dragged into openings that sealed behind them as though the hive was reclaiming what belonged to it. Still, the faithful grew bolder. They traced the veins, following them like pilgrims along sacred roads. The paths wound downward, always downward, converging toward the deep places where light had never reached. Great gatherings formed in these caverns, lit by guttering flames and the faint glow of the blood itself. The veins there pulsed thicker, bulging like arteries, throbbing with impossible life. The faithful pressed their bodies against them, listening to the beat, whispering their names into the flesh. Some swore they heard answers. The hive above began to rot. Manufactorum shut down as power rerouted itself toward the veins. Lifts froze between levels, their cables trembling with unnatural vibration. Entire hab-blocks lost lumen strips, yet their walls glowed faintly red, as if the veins within had learned to imitate light. The Arbites sealed more sectors, but sealing meant nothing when the walls themselves moved. There were whispers of blocked corridors reopening overnight, of sealed gates splitting apart as if gnawed from within. The Astra Militarum was finally called to intervene. Columns of soldiers in flak and steel helmets marched into the dying hive, laser guns ready, Vox lines alive with grim orders. But even they hesitated. What battle plan prepares a man for walls that bleed? For pipes that whisper his name? They held their ground for days, posting fire teams along arterial corridors, but discipline faltered quickly. Soldiers began disappearing from their posts, leaving only trails of bloody footprints that led into the walls themselves. When one squad fired into the veins, the hive screamed. The sound was indescribable, half machine, half beast, a roar that shook the city to its foundations. The soldiers broke. Some fled upward, some fled downward. Few were seen again. By then, the faithful were no longer hiding. They carried bowls of blood openly, offering them in place of food. Mothers dipped their infants in it, baptizing them in the hive's lifeblood. Workers daubed symbols on their tools, chanting that the hive had chosen them, that it was no longer a prison but a womb. A womb for what, none dared say. But the veins were spreading, growing thicker, and the hive's pulse grew louder with each passing night. Soon the city was no longer divided between faithful and fearful. The faithful grew too many and the fearful too few. To refuse the ash was to starve. To refuse the blood was to be marked for sacrifice. The hive had begun to feed itself, drawing life from both stone and flesh. It was becoming something else, and in its veins, something vast and unborn stirred, hungering for the moment it would open its eyes. The hive had ceased to feel like a city. Its avenues no longer rang with the clangor of machinery or the cries of merchants. Its air was no longer filled with the tang of smoke and oil, but with dust, fine, gray, endless dust that drifted through every level like a living fog. The faithful said it was holy, the breath of the hive itself, the sign that the city had ascended beyond mere stone and steel. To walk through it was to be blessed. To inhale it was to be remade, and all who lived within the hive inhaled. Whether by choice or by inevitability, it coated everything. The lips of children, the eyelids of sleepers, the cogitators of manufactorums. The Arbites tried to wear rebreathers, but the filters clogged within hours, forcing them to strip their masks away. They coughed until their lungs bled, and then they stopped coughing altogether. They breathed the dust calmly as if they had always been faithful. Some said they saw shapes in the drifting clouds, figures walking just out of reach, shadows of the dead keeping pace with the living. The sermons changed. The preachers no longer needed their words to compel. They only raised their hands and the dust itself moved, swirling into spirals, into forms that danced and sang with a will of their own. Followers knelt weeping, as the ash took shapes of loved ones lost, as long-dead faces smiled once more from the drifting haze. Many reached out to touch them, only to find the dust clung to their skin, sinking beneath their pores. They rose with the same smiles, the same empty eyes, singing the same hymn as the rest. It was said that in the deepest levels of the hive, the dust gathered like storms. Entire chambers choked with it, vision lost in gray whirlwinds that whispered prayers in 100 voices at once. Pilgrims walked into these storms with bowls in hand, returning with dust packed so thick it pulsed like wet clay. This became the holiest of sacraments, the purest form of the feast. Those who ate it shone faintly in the dark, their skin dusted with a permanent shimmer that never washed away. Their voices carried like bells, their words impossible to ignore. But there was another kind of ascension, one that none spoke of openly. In the nights when the hive groaned and the veins throbbed louder than before, some of the faithful rose into the air. Not leaping, not climbing, rising as if the dust itself bore them aloft. They hovered in silence, arms outstretched, ash pouring from their mouths like smoke from a furnace. Their followers wept, calling them saints chosen to leave flesh behind. But when the levitation ended, the saints did not return. Their bodies crumbled mid-air, collapsing into clouds of dust that scattered into the hive. The ecclesiarchy called it damnation. But their voices had grown faint, their temples swallowed by ash. Their priests were dragged into the storms, their aquilas torn down and remade from veins of pulsating flesh. When they burned their heretics, the flames themselves turned gray, choking them with clouds of sacred dust. One by one, their sermons fell silent until only the ash preachers remained. The Astra Militarum still fought, but their lines broke further each day. Soldiers abandoned their posts to kneel in drifting fog, eyes empty, mouths open. Some were found suffocated, lungs so full of ash they could no longer draw breath. Others were found alive, but their skin cracked and gray, their veins pumping not blood but fine powder. They sang as their bodies broke apart, scattering into the air, their brothers watching in horror as the wind carried their remains into the hive's lungs. The Mechanicus no longer sent messages. Their shrines had fallen quiet, their vox relays reduced to static that whispered in strange cadences. It was said the tech priests themselves had turned not by choice but because their augmetics inhaled dust just as flesh did. Machine and man alike were choked with it, cogitators wheezing as their circuits clogged with fine gray film. Yet even the machines began to sing, vox grills crackling hymns in broken tones, their logic corrupted into worship. Above, the hive spire was not spared. The dust rose like smoke through collapsed vents and broken lifts, blanketing the upper levels once thought safe. Nobles and merchants barricaded themselves in their towers, but their riches could not seal the air. They coughed into gilded chalices. They breathed into silken pillows, but the ash always found them. When they emerged at last, they came barefoot, cloaked in rags, chanting the same songs as the lowest have-born. The Hive had stripped them of everything but its faith. It was not simply death nor life. It was transformation. Dust gathered in great vortices at the heart of the Hive, forming pillars that reached from floor to ceiling. Pilgrims flocked to them, laying down in circles, allowing the ash to cover their bodies until only faint outlines remained. By dawn, those outlines were gone. The dust rose heavier, thicker, as if carrying their spirits upward. The Hive was no longer a city. It was a cathedral, not of stone, not of faith in Terra, but of dust and blood and ash. Its people had ceased to be citizens, workers, soldiers. They were particles carried on the breath of something vast, something unseen, something waiting to be born. And in the silence after the storms passed, the Hive's heart beat louder, as if savoring the taste of every life it had taken. Beneath every Hive lies a throne, not of gold, not of glory, but of rust and rot. A place where the weight of billions presses downward into silence. The old maps called it the foundations, the forgotten bones upon which the city was raised. Few had ever gone so deep, for the air was poison, the tunnels unstable, and the dark infinite. But now the faithful descended in droves, guided by veins that pulsed brighter with every level, guided by whispers that grew louder the further they fell. The descent was not like walking through ruins. It was like moving through a body. Corridors narrowed into throats of steel and stone. Air ducts wheezed like lungs, expelling gusts of fetid breath. The veins had grown thick here, bulging, glowing faintly, their pulse slow but steady, as though all the Hive above beat in rhythm with this place. The pilgrims pressed their hands to the walls, to the floor, to the ceiling, whispering thanks. They said they could hear it clearly now, the voice. At first it was only vibration, a hum that rattled teeth and bones. But soon it formed words, syllables that echoed not through ears but through the marrow itself. Every pilgrim swore the voice called their name. It was impossible, contradictory. Millions heard it at once, each convinced it spoke only to them. Yet none doubted, none resisted. They followed deeper still until they reached what had been hidden for millennia, the throne. It was no seat carved for men. It was vast, rising from the stone like a mountain, its surface layered with fossilized ash and fused bone. A dozen rivers of blood veins fed into its base, throbbing as though pumping life into a thing long dormant. Its shape was shifting, never quite still. Sometimes a spire of jagged stone, sometimes a hunched figure, sometimes nothing but a mound of breathing dust. At its heart sat no ruler, no statue, no icon of the emperor. Only a hollow, yawning gap that pulsed with light. When the pilgrims entered, they fell silent, for in the presence of the throne, there was no need for hymns. The voice sang for them. It rose from the hollow, 1,000 tones at once, male and female, child and elder, human and machine. It was sorrow and it was command. It told them they were chosen, not abandoned, that the Hive was not collapsing but ascending, that the emperor, silent above on Terra, had been replaced by something closer, something present, something that breathed with them. Some wept, crying that their faith had been answered. Others tore off their clothes and pressed themselves against the throne, begging to be taken holy. And some, more cautious, whispered of blasphemy, that no throne could rival the Golden One, that no voice could rival him. But their whispers died quickly, smothered by the voice itself, which grew louder until the doubters clawed at their own ears in agony. When their blood spilled upon the floor, the veins drank it greedily, and the throne pulsed brighter. The ecclesiarchy had feared this. They had spoken of thrones beneath thrones, of false idols that rose in times of weakness. Their scriptures warned of voices in the dark that mimicked divinity. But now their warnings meant nothing, for the Hive had seen the throne with their own eyes, and no scripture could unsee it. Stranger still was what began to happen in the days that followed. Pilgrims who lingered near the throne returned to the surface altered. Their skin bore the texture of stone, veins dark beneath their flesh. Their eyes glowed faintly, and when they opened their mouths, the voice spoke through them. They carried no weapons, yet entire Arbite squads fell before them, unable to fire, unable to move, as though the very will had been stolen from their bones. These pilgrims became heralds wandering the Hive, spreading the voice not by sermon but by presence. Where they walked, people knelt, and the throne was never silent. It demanded offerings, not wealth, not trinkets, but lives. Entire hab blocks vanished overnight, guided downward into the dark. Families marched willingly, hands clasped, children laughing, their songs rising as one. Those who resisted were taken anyway, dragged by their neighbors, their screams drowned beneath the hymn. None returned. Yet above, the hive did not mourn. They only listened for the voice that promised they had been accepted. The Astra Militarum, shattered though they were, made one last attempt to strike. They sent a company of stormtroopers with meltas and charges, ordered to collapse the depths and bury the throne. For days, Vox Contact reported progress. Corridors cleared, charges set, resistance scattered. But on the third day, the reports changed. The troopers' voices grew distant, their words slurred as if echoing from a great distance. Then they began to sing. The transmission ended not with static but with silence, silence that hummed like breath. Above, the hive shifted again. Towers leaned, walls groaned, arteries swelled. The people no longer spoke of survival. They spoke of coronation. The throne beneath the hive was not merely a seat. It was a womb, a voice, a promise. And soon it would no longer speak through walls and veins. Soon it would rise, and when it did, who in the galaxy would hear its song? There came a day when the hive stopped breathing. No smoke belched from its chimneys. No shrieks echoed in its manufactoria. No clang of steel or hum of machines rattled its bones. Instead, a stillness spread like frost, creeping over towers, hab blocks, and spires alike. The sky above was not black, nor red, nor even clouded. It was empty, stripped of color, as though the hive itself had swallowed the heavens. Those who lived within no longer worked, no longer fought, no longer dreamed. They simply listened. Every soul bent ear to the floor, the walls, the air itself. For the voice had grown so vast it no longer needed to whisper. It thundered through every corridor, every vein, every chest. It did not command. It was. The throne beneath the hive was full now. No longer hollow, no longer only light. Something sat within it. Something coalesced from the rivers of blood, from the bones of the faithful, from the millions who had descended willingly into its hunger. It had shape but no fixed form. A shifting crown of faces that wept and smiled in unison. A body woven of stone and flesh, metal and shadow. Its eyes were the hive's lights. Its tongue was the hive's vox. Its breath was the hive's pulse. It was not man. It was not God. It was something between. When it rose from its throne, the entire city groaned as though an ocean of stone were cracking apart. Spires buckled. Foundations split. Hab blocks tumbled like toys, yet no scream rose from the billions within. Instead, they sang. Their voices joined not in harmony but in oneness. A sound like a single throat stretched across a world. Even when their bodies were crushed, even when their towers fell, the song did not falter. It had passed beyond flesh. It lived in the voice now, in the thing that stood crowned beneath the hive. The Imperium's response came too late. From orbit, the skies burned with lances of fire. The Navy loosed torpedoes into the hive, collapsing towers, turning districts into oceans of molten glass. The earth shook for days, and the hive's upper reaches were reduced to ruins. Yet beneath, where the throne had rooted itself, no fire touched, no blast pierced. The veins glowed brighter in the wake of the bombardment, as though fed by the destruction itself. When the guns fell silent, the hive remained. Then the silence spread. At first, it was local. Vox units went dead, ships in orbit lost contact. Then whole sectors fell quiet, astropaths clutching their skulls as their songs of the Emperor were drowned out. And then, Terra itself shuddered, for the Astronomicon flickered. Just once, just for a moment, its beam faltered as though something vast had spoken across the warp. Every navigator in the segmentum awoke screaming. Every choir went hoarse. They said the voice had grown too large to be contained, that it was no longer bound to stone or blood or flesh, that the hive had not merely birthed an idol but a silence. A silence that devoured prayers, that swallowed hymns, that turned faith into fuel. The survivors on the surface told stories afterward. They said the hive had begun to walk, not as towers of stone, but as a body that dragged itself upward from the planet's crust. Entire continents cracked as it pulled free, a titanic carcass of city and flesh rising into the sky. Its shadow covered oceans. Its veins glowed like rivers of molten light. And on its crown, where once a spire of industry had stood, there now sat a throne of bone upon which the shifting figure gazed outward into the stars. The survivors said they saw its face, and it was not alien, it was not demonic. It was their own. Millions of faces woven together, eyes wide, mouths open in eternal song. The Imperium burned records. They purged archives. They silenced witnesses. Officially, the Hive had fallen to rebellion and was destroyed in righteous fire. Officially, nothing walked from its ashes. Officially, the voice had never been heard. But silence has its own truth. Across the stars, scattered pilgrims still speak its song in whispers. They hum in forgotten tongues, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Ships vanish in warp without trace. Astropathic choirs cut short mid-hymn, replaced by static that feels like breath. Whole worlds go dark, not from fire, not from plague, but from silence. And some claim when they kneel in prayer that they no longer feel the Emperor's light. Instead, they hear a hum, a breath. A name spoken not in sound, but in marrow. The Hive is gone. The throne is empty. The voice remains. It does not rise in fire. It rises in silence.